Future tense begins with Enterprise having already stumbled across some kind of tiny ship, and so they're here to investigate, which typically involves poking with a stick and then running up a tree. They bring the ship on board and eventually find what they think might be a hatch, fused shut.
With your permission, sir.
Yes, definitely. You should get some cutting tools to begin the painstaking, careful cutting of this mysterious ship to preserve anything that might... Or you could just shoot the goddamn thing. Really, I'm not even surprised anymore. Archer then pries the door open. I'm only shocked it doesn't involve C4, and crawls inside to discover the pilot, a decayed human-looking individual, which T'Pol confirms to be human. The mystery is how he got here. The ship is further out than any human has ever gone, so what the hell? Plus, this is the middle of nowhere. Literally. No ships or inhabited systems anywhere. He's just floating dead in deep space in a ship that looks like a giant IKEA cam screw. Archer wonders if perhaps this answers the mystery of what happened to Zephram Cochrane, whom you might recall spent his retirement on an episode of TOS. Score 1 for continuity. Remembering somebody who's been missing when a missing person shows up, well, hats off to you, Enterprise. Now they just need to figure out what this is.
So what do you think, Travis? Could this pilot have been a cargo hauler?
Well, why would he be in this if he was a cargo hauler? You've already established it's not an escape pod, it's his ship. You're not suggesting that he's transporting cargo in a ship that's got the storage space of a Prius, are you? Well, shockingly, Trip's silly question is proved justified, because after removing some organic technology and a panel, they find this guy is smuggling another dimension around with him. So there really was the room. I can only shake my head at fate justifying Trip like this. Next, they're going to find 1,000 microscopic crates right next to a shrink ray. Even Tucker finds this hard to believe, so he drops a tool inside because he wants to make sure this isn't a hologram. Why someone would make such a hologram is dubious, but admittedly, pointless optical illusion is a lot more logical than the rules of spatial dimensions no longer work here. When the tool hits the bottom, they know this is real and crawl down to see what they'll find. But it's like heading to the back of a taxidermist shop. There's nothing back there that you can understand, and it's all unsettling in the first place. While they're busy poking around, there's a little bit of excitement on the bridge because a Suliban ship showed up. Minimal weapons might make you optimistic, but I doubt this is a grateful escapee from Archer's prison break. Nope, this guy is claiming salvage rights. If you're curious, salvage law isn't, if I find it and no one else is around, I get to keep it, much like what Cisco did in the ship, which I didn't call out because no one calls out the Cisco unless they need a tooth or two removed. It's about compensation relative to a number of factors, which might just come down to keep the ship, if the owner or the insurer says so. But the Suliban operate under a different rule about salvage. If I see it and there's no one else around, it's mine, and it's mine forever, even if someone picks it up first. Even by the I get to keep it rule of salvage, this makes no sense, because the moment you leave, you've lost it too. But Suliban gonna Suliban, so they make threats if Archer doesn't hand it over, and Archer isn't in an accommodating mood right now. Besides, it would look really bad if they were right and he just handed over Zephram Cochrane's ship to the Suliban. Even on his spotty record, that's going to stand out. Meanwhile, Reed picked up a power source behind a panel, so he and Trip eventually get it open and pull something out, only to get ambushed by a couple of Suliban who are hiding in the launch bay. Trip is taken out of the fight, but Reed manages to keep the other one busy long enough to foil the scheme, so the Suliban beam away. I guess that's how they got on board. I was starting to wonder if the intent was that the Suliban had clung to the hull the whole time and just held their breath. It wouldn't have surprised me, really. Enterprise is going to hand this off to the Vulcans. Pride is all well and good, but if the Enterprise nearly lost it to a transport, then maybe it's time to see how well Pride can be swallowed. But for now, Trip's opened the doohickey, thinking that it might be the black box, and he notes the use of organic circuitry, just like the rest of the ship. And speaking of gooey things, Phlox calls up to report on the dead guy. It's not Zephram Cochrane. It's weirder than that. The guy isn't fully human. He's a hybrid with some Vulcan, Tyrellian, and another DNA sequence you can't even tell, although sheep is rather common in some areas of the world. But it doesn't make any sense. The fragments indicate distant ancestors, back before the first warp flight. So Archer concludes the only sensible thing. Time travel. Hey, it does make sense. Otherwise, it'd be like learning that Vulcans visited Earth in the 20th century. Probably one of T'Pol's relatives, since we're being ridiculous here.
I'm not certain Daniels would approve of this.
We'll keep it to ourselves.
Rightio, because the only way a time agent can learn anything is from listening to rumors. T'Pol seems a little put out at the thought of their species genetically intermingling, which is actually consistent with non-Star Trek lessons. In other stories, when humans and alien DNA is mixed, the result is a monster. In Gene Roddenberry's Star Trek, the only thing you get is the result of sweet, sweet love. But they turn back to the matter at hand, and eventually track down the type of ship commissioned 900 years in the future. Think about that. Imagine introducing the crew of a state-of-the-art 12th century Chinese junk to the USS Gerald R. Ford. Show them a metal ship with flying craft kept aboard, powered by nuclear reactors, and partially staffed by frickin' robots. And all they would think is, wow, this President Ford must have been a god among men. Now, in that case, there would be limited chance to disrupt time. Even if you actually gave them an aircraft carrier to study as long as they want. Go nuts, guys. Try to figure this thing out. They don't have a fundamental understanding of some of the principles, so they can't. Nobody can. I mean, if you could assemble Leonardo da Vinci, Galileo, Sir Isaac Newton, and a dozen more Renaissance scientists together and hand them an iPhone, they're not going to build you another one, not after 50 years. 50 years, they'll still be trying to figure out what plastic is. But what makes this time ship so dangerous is the temporal Cold War. The Suliban would have no more luck understanding the temporal drive than our Renaissance team and iPhone. But with the technical understanding of Future Guy to help them out, then they could learn the fundamental principles necessary to at least know how to study it, understand it, and eventually be able to build their own. So, keeping it out of their hands, that's priority 1. Priority 2 is getting your freak on with a hot Vulcan. Purely in the name of science. Things get interesting, though, when a new player enters the situation. The Tholians. Mike Sussman, who wrote this with Phyllis Strong, was a big fan of the Tholians and brought them back not only for this, but also for the previously covered In a Mirror Darkly two-parter. Also of making the time ship an homage to the TARDIS from Doctor Who. But yeah, the Tholians have been discussed numerous times since their introduction in the Tholian web, but this is the first time we've seen them in action since then. T'Pol could have done without it, though, because the Tholians are usually bad news, fiercely xenophobic, and not in the Ellen Ripley kind of way. They say they want the ship, that it's dangerous and the temporal radiation will doom them. When Archer doesn't agree, they try taking the ship, but Archer threatens to blow it up if they try, so they leave.
What did he say?
I don't know. But I don't think he was paying you a compliment.
If he was, he'd be the first. There's a scene where Phlox has another meal with T'Pol, and the continued issue of the Vulcan Science Institute concluding time travel is impossible comes up. A few ideas are explored, but it's an issue of logic versus changes. Reminds me of a conversation, supposedly, from Ludwig Wittgenstein and a friend about the way the sun appears to move in the sky on an Earth that rotates, and what it would have looked like if the sun had gone round the Earth like people used to think. Answer: it would have looked the same. It's only with the inclusion of further facts that one sees that the latter cannot be true, that a perfectly logical truth can, in fact, be dead wrong, once further evidence comes to light. And speaking of philosophy, Reed and Tucker debate the implications of time travel. It's always funny that when other people write Trip, he sounds competent, perhaps even intelligent. And then when his creators write him, he's a fucking boat mechanic scratching his nuts with a plutonium rod. But they run into a problem when trying to work on the ship, repeatedly looping the same conversation. So when it's reported, Archer orders the area sealed off just to be safe. No one wants to be stuck in a looped conversation with Trip. You can only hear so much about catfish before blowing your brains out. In private, T'Pol warns that someone might do that for them. 2 attacks so far, and the Vulcan ship is a ways off. But, try not to be too surprised, Archer is not going to be persuaded that he's wrong. When it comes to facts, Archer uses that chin of his like an Arctic icebreaker to just tear them apart right before him. Well, the best laid plans of mice and morons. First, the black box is not a black box. There are no answers here. It's a tiny transmitter, probably a homing beacon. And the Sulibans show up, a whole fleet of them. Now, most of them are those little pods, but there's a lot of them, and even Reed can only fire so many guns at once. So Archer is just counting on making this a race, getting to the Vulcans before the Suliban can overwhelm them. Only, the Vulcan ship is disabled. It's surrounded by Tholian ships. This time they're loaded for bear. It's only the Suliban's insistence to fight for it that buys Enterprise some time to try to cook up a plan. Trip is going to try to get that homing beacon working while a torpedo is put in the time ship in order to blow it up. Doing that will be Reed, because he's the munitions expert, and Archer, because he's the captain, so he's got nothing better to do. This is complicated enough as it is, so it's a real poor time for a time loop to show up, but it does. They're still on the second run-through by the time the Tholians have completely wiped out the Suliban and are demanding the ship, ready to breach in order to get it. Fortunately, third time's the charm as Archer loads the torpedo and drops the ship out into space. And all for nothing. The Tholians neutralize the warhead and go to make off with the ship. T'Pol is going to deliver the ultimate "I told you so" about that, you know it. The only good news there is that at the moment can't be looped, so she can only rub it in his face the one time. Well, fortunately for the purity of the time stream, Trip has the beacon working, the time ship, the body, all vanish, and the Tholians take off. Archer's surprised they're just leaving, but it seems Enterprise isn't even worth blowing up to them. I can't really argue with that. Post-episode follow-up. Annoying character goes to T'Pol for her creeped-out response to a Vulcan-human hybrid. She acts like one of her people had sex with a dog. All scores are relative to their series. Final score for Future Tense is 8 out of 10. One of several stronger ones late in the second season, helped by much better character work. Aside of his fixation on learning more about the temporal Cold War from that ship, Archer seems a bit better than usual, even offering a personal apology to the Vulcans for what happened to their ship, a surprising move to say the least. And Reed proves an effective counterpoint to Tucker. It shows how much the show really needed someone else in control. When you passed it off to others, the characters gained more dimensions to them. The debate between those two, for instance, was deliberately kept unresolved. Trip's point that not knowing if you married someone for the right reasons might eat at you is just as valid as Reed's that if you're happy, then that's what matters. It's a complicated issue, and all the worse if you think about not getting your happily ever after. Would you want to know you screwed things up? Would you want to know that you're going to make a mistake and ruin your life? Unlikely. Not unless you were told you could prevent it, of course. Or at the very least, be told that maybe you're going to have to live with that mistake, but maybe you'll also get a second chance to learn from it too.
All hail the Overlord! All hail the Overlord!
Malcolm?
See it.
Good. Means I'm not hallucinating. How can a ship be bigger on the inside than the outside?